Hello YouTube, and welcome to the ultimate ab exercises tier list. This is going to be the start of the last cycle of this series. We have already covered pretty much every muscle of the upper body. We did the arms, we did the back, we did the shoulders, and now we're going to complete that with the core. If you have missed the previous installments, do not worry, they are available for you in the description. You can go check them out. But for today, we are going to focus on this muscle group that everyone desires, the abs. Everyone wants a six-pack. But sadly, as I've said in the past multiple times, there's so many misconceptions that float around that many people just end up putting in efforts and getting no results back. The worst of these misconceptions being that abs are made in the kitchen. This is, of course, idiotic. Just like any other muscle group, the abs are built in the gym. And so if you don't train them, you won't have a developed core. If you are already training your core, however, you are ahead of the pack and you are on the right path. But it's still not enough. You should still be focusing on the quality of the exercise you are doing, and that is exactly why I'm making this video today. Hopefully, it will also help dispel another misconception, a myth I hear thrown around a lot, especially by science-based bodybuilders who repeat ad nauseum that any ab exercise that also recruits the hip flexors is a bad ab exercise because in their heads, the hip flexor is going to steal the work. The issue with that mindset is that it's not taking into account the fact that muscles work together. So it's sort of the equivalent of telling someone to not do any horizontal presses like a dip or a bench press to train their chest because it also recruits the shoulders. It makes absolutely no sense. The body works as a unit. It's perfectly normal for muscles to fire together. If you look at its function, the function of the hip flexor is to bring the knees closer to the torso. And the function of the abdominal wall and the muscles of the core is to support the body during movement by stretching and contracting, which by definition also means that the only way to recruit them is to allow another muscle to move the body through space so that the abs can actually fulfill their function of stabilization. And most of the time, with good ab exercises, that muscle is going to be the hip flexors. So that argument is not only wrong, but it also is what prevents people from doing the proper movements that would lead to them having a developed six-pack. You will see that throughout this tier list, I will attempt to do what I just did. I'm going to try and justify my choices and explain to you why certain lifts are good or bad. The goal of these episodes is not just to feed you good exercises, I also want you guys to be able to think rationally about what makes or breaks a good exercise. And since today is a core tier list, I'm not just going to talk about the abdominals. We're also going to look at the lower abs, the obliques, and the serratus muscles. And for the sake of comprehension, for those of you who don't know, the function of the serratus is protraction and upward scapular rotation, which essentially means that it allows the shoulders to move in space. And the function of the obliques is to rotate and twist the trunk, which is extremely important because it also means that bending and twisting the spine to train the abs is not dangerous. It's a natural function of the muscle and the human body, and it's perfectly safe as long as you're not a complete idiot. Once again, I bring it up because a ton of the best exercises in this tier list are going to fall within that category. And I know for a fact that some people are going to ask me, well, isn't that hip flexors? Isn't that too much lower back? Isn't that dangerous to twist like this? No, it's not. If I put the exercise that high, it's because it's good. When it comes to how I'll be judging these movements, the criteria I will be using is whether or not there is a good stretch, because the abs need to stretch to hypertrophy, how much effective range of motion there is in the movement, meaning how much the abs actually work throughout the movement and how much is just wasted energy, and how easy it is to load and progress, because yes, you're also supposed to progressively overload if you want a blocky core. And based on how well these lifts manage to fulfill these criteria, they will be placed in the following 5 tiers. For today, our lowest tier is called the Scrawny-tier, because to me, there is nothing worse than a skinny dude with a six-pack. If you're skinny and you have abs, it simply doesn't count. You just are lean. You don't have muscle development. You want to be big and have a nice core. So every single exercise put in that D tier, I want you to avoid. They are complete garbage. The C tier is the mediocre tier. These movements, for the most part, you will find tend to have too much range of motion but not be that effective, or they're hard to load, or they're too easy, or it's tough to progress on. Then you have the B tier, the decent tier, where these exercises are okay, but they might be too technical, they might require too much skill, and so they could be better replaced by something else. Or it could also be that they only work the abs as a byproduct, which is okay, but this is something for pure ab exercises. And then you have the A tier, the excellent tier, where this is money. This is when I want you guys to actually give these exercises a try. They have their place in every program. These are very, very good exercises, but they're not perfect yet. There is still something missing. And if they had that something, they would be placed in the S tier. And for today, our S tier is called the Greek god tier, because if you look at Greek statues of the past, the reason why we love them so much, we take inspiration and we find them so aesthetic, is for one reason and one reason only: their core. They have a chiseled core. Their serratus muscles are like feathers on the sides of their body. The obliques are beautifully sculpted. Everything is perfect, and that is what we want. A core is in the middle of the body. It makes or breaks your physique. So these exercises are going to be your best friend if you want to have magnificent abs. And now that this has been established, we can begin with the tier list proper, starting with crunches. I begin with this because it's sort of a good introduction to how and why I'm going to place certain movements in certain tiers. So it's now widely known that crunches are a bad ab exercise, but the reason why is not necessarily because it's bad or dangerous for the lower back, as I often hear. It's mostly because there's little range of motion, and on top of that, the little you're doing is not that effective because there is minimal stretch. So this is simply not something I want to see you do. Banish this movement from your program and you will find that your abs are going to thank you. So I'm naturally going to place it in the D tier. Then we have planks. So planks are also a staple. You find them in a lot of novice programs, and they're not bad per se. I actually do think that it's highly beneficial for a novice to learn how to do planks because it teaches you how to brace. So it teaches you how to recruit the abs for one of their function, which is controlling the stability of the core and also controlling internal pressure within the core. In the long run, this is going to be key because it's going to prevent injuries and form degradation. But I'm still only going to place it in the mediocre tier because they quickly become redundant. You will get so strong that it will take forever to you to actually film that movement. And on top of that, you will also often find that what falls first is your shoulders and your arms. It's not even your core. Why? Because your arms are placed directly underneath the body. So the arms do most of the work. If you look at people who attempt world records in the plank, that's what they do. They put their arms underneath their body in the middle of the center mass. Why? Because it makes it easier to hold. But for hypertrophy, it's simply not what we want. So if you wanted a type of plank, a plank variation that would be better suited for muscle growth, you would need to find one that puts the abs in a difficult position. And the long lever plank does exactly that. By moving the arms away from center mass, it makes it so that now the abs have to do most of the work. So I'm going to place them in the decent tier. It's still not really good because to me, this type of isometric contraction and static holds at some point become redundant because you get a ton of it directly from compound movement. So only B tier. If you want to be able to crack the A or S tier, you have to provide something else. You have to give me something I don't already get somewhere else. And that something for the most part is the stretch, which is why the sit-up that provides a tremendous stretch is going into the excellent tier. Now, a properly executed sit-up is one where you're going to have your feet hooked underneath something to be able to pull. Does it recruit hip flexors? Yes, that is the point, to allow the torso to go into the negative and to feel that stretch. Every single person I know who have an advanced physique and also an advanced core were obsessed with sit-ups at some point or the other. We would spend hours doing sit-ups. Was it optimal? Fuck no. Did it work? Fuck yes. So sit-ups are still very good. But they're not the best type of sit-ups. Other variations are even better. Like for example, the decline bench sit-ups that I'm going to put in the Greek god tier. If you have access to a decline bench, please start doing that movement. It's everything you want. It's stable, good negative, good stretch, effective range of motion, and it's easy to load. You can start with body weight and then you can go up plates, dumbbells, and you can go up to 60, 70 pounds. But before you get to that, you already have a nice core because it is extremely challenging. Now, there is a risk of injury if you're an idiot and you dive into the negative because when you revert into the positive, what is going to allow the abs to do the work is the hip flexors. So they're going to stretch immediately in an instant, and that could lead to a tear. So solution is very simple: do slow negatives, don't ego lift, and don't be an idiot, and you'll be just fine. And these are movements that are good for the abdominals in general. But as I said, this is a core tier list, so I'm also going to focus on obliques. And when it comes to obliques, sadly, most people train them wrong. They will do something, for example, like a barbell oblique twist, where you put a loaded barbell on your back and you either tilt your torso from side to side or you rotate the torso. The issue with this is that now you have to fight the momentum of the bar, balance becomes an issue, and on top of that, range of motion is not that great. So what ends up happening is that you use way too much weight and you get no results whatsoever, which is why I'm putting this in the D tier. There are simply better ways to recruit the obliques. This is going to add additional actual loading onto your program that is already most likely full of it with your squats and deadlifts. So there is really no reason to train your obliques like this. And training them with dumbbells is not that great either. And this is the one that you see the most. This is the #1 oblique exercise worldwide, even though it's fairly mediocre, which is why I'm putting the dumbbell side bends in mediocre tier. This is one that I'm certain you've seen. People grab a dumbbell or they grab a barbell and they just twist on the side like this. Problem being that it's the exact same issue. The range of motion is not that great. If you do over-exaggerate the range of motion, the obliques are not recruited anymore. Most of that is structure, so you start to lean, you start to use your hips. It's not dangerous. Every time someone tries to say that this exercise is bad, they will say, oh, you'll hurt your spine. Unless you're an idiot, again, you won't. But that's not even the problem here. The problem is that you're doing an exercise that is simply not following the function of the obliques. Too much of the range of motion is not doing what the obliques want to do. So how exactly do you do something better? Well, you could try a bodyweight movement like the side plank dips that I'm placing in the descent tier. This is a movement that starts as a plank, but then you're going to move your hips up and down. And why is it so much better? Well, first and foremost, because your hips are going to prevent you from going into too much range of motion. So the amount of spinal flexion is never going to be over-exaggerated because you run into the ground. And then you're stopped at the top by the fact that, well, the anatomy of the body doesn't allow you to just keep rising because your hips at some point hit the end of the range of motion. So it keeps the obliques within the relevant range of motion. The only problem with that movement being that it is actually quite tough to load. You could, if you wanted, grab a dumbbell and rest it on your hip. I find it personally that it is not that practical. So you'll find that there is a much better way, because all of these movements attempt to train the obliques by bending. And yes, absolutely, that is a function of the obliques. But I have found personally that this is not the best way to develop that muscle group in particular, because again, the range of motion is mostly going to go to waist, and the tiny amount that is relevant for the obliques is going to require you to use so much weight that you could be doing something instead, and that something is a twist. I find that the function of the twist to the side is much more relevant to developing the obliques in the human body, which is why I'm placing something as simple as a cable side twist into the excellent tier, because this is going to allow you to actually recruit that portion of the core without having to deal with fatigue that is going to go somewhere else. This is extremely easy to recover from, and you will find that it targets the muscle you want to target. The only problem being that you might find out eventually that the outstretching of the arms in this position might become the limiting factor. In which case, what can we do? What can we find as a method to make sure that it's only the obliques that work and they go to failure? Well, I actually found a type of twisting of the spine that gets you off your feet. So now there's no extra range of motion where you rely on the spine. And it's also easy to load. And this is the oblique extensions. It's a rare movement, quite exotic, and you almost never see it, but it's extremely good. If what you want is an oblique isolation that won't fatigue the rest of the body, this is the one you want. On top of that, again, because your hips run into the pad, it's almost impossible to overextend, so the risk of injury is zero, which is why I'm placing that into the Greek god tier. If you are obsessed with the idea of or notion of bending the spine, this is one that you should give a try. And then we get into calisthenics. So calisthenics athletes have a reputation for having very developed cores. And that is due in part because they are very lean, because the leaner they are, the lighter they also are. So all of these movements become much easier. But it's also true that the practice in itself produces ab hypertrophy. And how exactly does it do that? Well, for the most part, it is through stabilization. Something like a planche, for example, requires tremendous core stabilization because you have to prevent your pelvis from falling. Does it make it a good movement for hypertrophy? Fuck no. I'm placing the planche in the scrawny tier because the amount of balance and the amount of technical skill you need to be able to get there is simply not worth it for bodybuilding. Keep in mind that calisthenics is a skill-based sport. So if you look at someone doing a planche, they don't have good abs because they're doing the planche. They're doing the planche because they have good abs. They had to work the muscle to acquire the function. Bodybuilding is the exact opposite, so there's not much use for that. And the front lever is in the same ball game. It is simply way too demanding in terms of technical skills for the type of hypertrophy it will provide. So I'm placing it in the mediocre tier. When calisthenics starts to become more interesting when it comes to developing the abs is when we start actually involving the pelvis and moving those legs around with something like a toes to bar. The toes to bar is actually a great way to develop your core. Issue being that half of the range of motion past the point where the legs are parallel with the floor is quote-unquote wasted because the abs are almost entirely disengaged and other muscles take over. So I'm placing it in the decent tier. It's not bad per se, but we can optimize the movement for muscle growth. And how do we optimize it? Well, quite simple. We simply cut down on the range of motion. More range of motion is not always better. More effective range of motion is. So what do? We don't do the top portion, which leaves us with a hanging leg raise. Hanging leg raises are touted as a great ab exercise, and it is absolutely true. So they go into the excellent tier. The limitation of the movement being, of course, the grip. That being said, I have found that you can absolutely get to a point where your grip stops being the limiting factor if you get strong enough on pull-ups or dead hangs, at which point it's only core, you get a tremendous stretch, and unlike what some people say, yes, it does develop the lower abs. Why? Because even though you initiate the movement with your hip flexors to get the legs to move, what catches the legs on the negatives and has to stretch is the abs, and in particular, the lower portion of the abs. So even though it's impossible to isolate the lower abs, you can still have a movement that is skewed towards lower abs, and that's exactly that. But it's still not S tier. Why? Because leg raises are difficult since the top of your foot is away from the body. So some people tell themselves, well, that's good, right? More difficulty equals more hypertrophy. Not necessarily, because it does mean that you recruit more hip flexors. So how do we reduce the lever arm and how do we fix the strength curve? Well, it's quite simple. You bend your legs. So instead of doing a hanging leg raises, you're going to do a hanging knee raises. And if you do that, it is now S tier, because you will find that your ability to rotate the pelvis and therefore to engage the abs is greatly improved. You can do more reps and you can focus on good form. The only issue with these two being that, yeah, you have the stability issue of having to grip onto the bar, but again, you can fix it if you get strong enough. And then it's also very hard to load because while you can use ankle weights like I do, or you can use a dumbbell in between your legs, but that might be dangerous. But I have found that if you do knee raises properly with a full range of motion, meaning that you actually tilt the knees at the top and you allow the glutes to go under the body, and then you go into a full stretch, you will not be able to do that many. Like if you can do 10 to 12 clean with a slow negative, you already have a pretty developed abs. So I think that these two movements should be a go-to for anyone who wants better abs, especially lower abs. What you should not be doing, however, is taking fat burners. I really hope that no one watching this video is doing that, is stupid enough to buy these products. But since humans are inherently lazy, I also know that some people want a six-pack, but they don't want to work for it, so they'll just try to burn the fat. But if there's no abs underneath, you're just going to end up with a shitty six-pack, and that's if the product works. Plot twist, it doesn't fucking work. So, fat burners, Scrawny-tier, stop trying to look for the easy way out and put in the work. There are so many good exercises out there. And if you want to be able to progress towards hanging leg raises, there are other variations that are almost just as good. For example, the candle raise. The candle raise is a type of laying leg raise where you end up pushing the glutes up and letting the lower back elevate from the floor at the end of the movement. This is a great way to progress towards more difficult variations, so I'm putting it in the excellent tier because anyone can do it, it's done with body weight. And something like knee raises done in a Roman chair also fall in the same category. This is actually one that you see people do a lot at the gym, and that's great because it's a good movement. It's going to force you into a relevant range of motion, you won't over-exaggerate, and the stability issue is taken care of because you are safely and comfortably placed in the chair. So this is also an excellent movement for the abs. And if you want to bias the obliques, you can just do it side to side. That way, the sides of the core are going to be recruited in priority. But overall, I have found, and you will see that in this tier list as well, that some of the best ab exercises don't require any equipment. You can just do them at home with body weight or with a tiny bit of added weight. A lot of these machines that seem to try and target the core do a horrible job at it. Example, the ab twister machine. The name itself sounds like a torture device, so it's not surprising that I'm going to put it in the mediocre tier. The problem with the machine is that it freezes the entire body, and most importantly, it freezes the hips because you're sitting. If the function of bending the spine is best done without involvement of the legs because it prevents excessive range of motion, the exact opposite is true when you twist. Twisting the spine is something you do with the hips. It's a full body movement. You're going to end up over-recruiting the structure of the spine because you cannot shift your feet around as the hips twist. It's simply not natural. And I'm certain that many people have strained their abs or strained their lower back doing that thing. So avoid it at all costs. Instead, you want something that is going to provide a load and tension, but also give you the ability to move the body freely through space. You want to be able to arrange the body around the machine, and nothing is better at that than a cable station, which is why something like a standing cable crunch I'm going to put in the B tier. I still have problems with that movement, however. First off, if you do it like the guy in the little picture I selected, you're doing it wrong because you're going to use too much arms. You're supposed to do it behind the back. Even behind the back, you can end up using too much arms because it's a movement done standing up for the abdominals. So again, we fall back into the logic of, is it good or is it bad? In this case, in my opinion, it's bad because you're going to over-rely on body weight. The amount of times I see fat people in the gym doing that movement and they just let gravity do the work by falling forward, you think you're working something here. The machine is working. The machine is going to snap. You are doing absolutely nothing. So this is a noob trap because naturally you're going to want to take the easy way out. So you need perfect technique to make this one work. There are easier ways to use machines to recruit the abs. Example, an ab crunch machine. This one is fairly rare. I have personally never seen one in any gym I've ever been to. They can be death traps if it's some bullshit made in China or something where the range of motion is all over the place and it overextends your spine. But if it's a good one, it's a good one. It's going to go into excellent tier because it's going to allow you to load the abdominals within a relevant range of motion, and it makes the progressive overload of the movement also extremely easy because the machine does it for you. But again, because the settings are preset and they might not be aligned with the way you're built, I think that something done with a cable would be better. So how do we take this standing cable crunch and make it good? Well, simple, you do it kneeling. So you're going to take a mat, you're going to take a towel so that you don't hurt your knees, and you're going to kneel down in front of the machine. That way you will not be able to use your body weight to pull. You're going to have to recruit the core to pull. This is one of the best ab exercises of all times. I'm putting it into the S tier. Mind you, you can still fuck it up, but if done properly, this is something that you can do in a low rep range. It's extremely safe. It's going to make your abs soar like you've never felt before, and you can very easily progressively overload that movement. So this should be a good solution for anyone who is afraid of over-recruiting their hip flexors or they don't have the technical skills to be able to do hanging leg raises or stuff like this. It's always going to be a better solution than all of this modern bullshit like core sculpting or ab implants. I'm including them in the tier list because even though they're not exercises, I want to make sure I prevent as many people as possible from making that mistake. Stop relying on pseudo-surgical procedure to fix your fuck-ups. You got fat, lose the fat. Liposuctions or core sculpting is just going to reinforce your bad habits. So Scrawny-tier. And for ab implants, I mean, this is a bodybuilding channel. I'm all about aesthetics and looking good, but fuck, the abs are such an important muscle. If you actually look at certain studies, there is a direct correlation between ab development and core development and mortality rates. The more developed your core is, the longer you live. Why? Because you have less visceral fat, but also because you are mobile longer. The core protects the spine. It allows the spine to move in place. You want to have a healthy lower back until you're 80 and 90. Train your abs. Don't just get implants that only work as an aesthetic replacement for something you should be working for. So, ab implants, D tier. And now we move into the big mover category of this video. We move to compound movements. Compound movements, I've said it times and times again, are not enough for ab development, but they still do something because they fulfill a function of the core, which is stabilization and internal pressure. So something like a pull-up, for example, I think goes into C tier because it's going to require your abs to stretch to make sure that your pelvis, your legs, and everything else doesn't just fall. And of course, it cannot fall, it's attached to the body. But anyone who has done pull-ups at least once in their life know that something happens to your abs as you do the exercise. They are actually being recruited. And the same goes for squats and deadlifts. You have people who end up with a fairly developed core doing only heavy squats and heavy deads. And this is especially true for the obliques, because the function of the obliques is, yes, to bend and twist the spine, but it's also to resist the bending and twisting of the spine. So when you pull heavy or you squat heavy, your spine wants to shift, but the muscles of the obliques prevent it from doing so as the other muscles move the weight. So I'm placing squats and deads and heavy lower body compounds in general in the decent tier. And knowing what we know about the function of the obliques, this should also mean that if we do a unilateral movement, they're going to be recruited more, right? Because one side is going to want to bend and the other one is going to have to work harder to prevent that from happening. So something like a suitcase deadlift is a great idea because now you don't have to use as much weight as with a regular deadlift, which is going to allow you to isolate the obliques more. So for anyone who greatly enjoys compound movements, you should give this one a try. It is an excellent option to develop that muscle in particular. But it's still lacking a stretch component. And when we think about stretch, we think about sit-ups. And there's actually a variation that, just like the decline bench sit-up, is going to provide you with that extra range of motion. And that is the glute arm raise sit-up, where your back is not actually supported by the bench, so you can actually extend the spine even more. That could be a problem. I want you to be careful when you do that exercise. Don't go into too much of a range of motion. But if you know what you're doing, this is also an S tier movement. It's very easy to load. You can put the weight behind your head. And this is going to give you DOMs like no others because the abs are going to have to stretch a lot to support your body weight, which ultimately results in a lot of hypertrophy. On the flip side, something that never results in any hypertrophy whatsoever is these ab stimulators things. I'm certain that you've seen them. They are beloved by middle-aged men who are lazy and fat. It's those things, those patches that you put on your abs and they're supposed to shock the muscle into growth. That has never worked. Thankfully, as we say in French, la nature est bien faite, and lazy people never get the results that they want because they're too pussy to put in the work. So this shit also goes into the scrawny tier. When a product is advertised 100% by slapping it on someone who is on PEDs, you know for a fact that the product does not work. But enough about marketing gurus and all of the bullshit of the fitness industry. Let's talk about the serratus muscle. It is that muscle that runs on the side of the body right here and that a lot of people desire but can't quite seem to get because most of the time when you see someone with a good serratus development, they are extremely lean. However, even someone like me who is high body fat and on the bulk is able to have some semblance of development. Why? Because I train my serratus, it's a muscle, train it and it will grow. And what are the best ways to grow the serratus? Well, I told you earlier that the functions of the serratus muscle are protraction and upward scapular rotation, aka movement of the arms and the shoulders, which is why many people who have shoulder issues should be training their serratus because it will fix their problems. And there are multiple ways to target them, most of which are rehab oriented. I'm not a doctor, this is not a rehab video, I'm only going to talk about hypertrophy. So something like a serratus uppercut might be great for rehab, but for hypertrophy it's not that good, which is why I'm putting it in the D tier, because the idea is that you move the arm, so you move the scapula with it, and you're going to try and recruit the muscle in that fashion, but you're going to do it with a dumbbell, so the strength curve is going to be fairly bad, the tension is not going to be constant, and you're going to find that you're going to recruit much more shoulder than you do serratus. So if what you want is that muscle to grow, it's something you should be avoiding. And in the same vein, when it comes to moving the arms through space, there is the scapular lat raises, where it's essentially lat raises that instead of doing directly outside of the body or in front of the body, you do in between. So you do it in the scapular plane. And there are now more and more people who are saying that this is actually also the best way to do shoulder raises for the deltoid development. I don't know about that. This is not a shoulder tier list. If you want to access the shoulder tier list, it's in the description. But for serratus, my issue is the same. This is mostly going to be a shoulder movement, which leaves you with a conundrum, because if you use too much weight, well, now you're definitely going to use more shoulders. And if you use little weight, now the shoulders are not going to receive much stimulus, but the serratus are not going to receive stimulus either. So this is also not the best option. I'm putting it in the mediocre tier. If you want a motion that is going to stretch the serratus by allowing the arms to move through space, there is the time-tested pullovers. And yes, the pullovers magically always find a way to appear in every tier list, but the pullover propaganda never dies. If you're not doing pullovers yet, what the fuck are you doing with your life? It is, yes, going to develop the lats, it's going to develop the long head of the tricep and the chest to some extent, but it's also a great movement for the serratus, so I'm placing it in the decent tier. The reason why it doesn't go higher is because the limiting factor on the pullover is never ever going to be the serratus, so you'll never be able to go to failure on it. But considering the lift already does so much for you, the fact that it's still going to develop the side of your core is a plus I simply cannot ignore. But if you want something that is going to be pure isolation for the serratus, where all of the range of motion goes towards the serratus, you cannot go wrong with a serratus push-up. Some people also call it a scapular push-up. In my opinion, it is excellent. Why? Because even though it's a tiny range of motion, that's the relevant range of motion for the muscle you're trying to target. If you have someone who can put a plate on your back, you can load it. It's not going to be super convenient, but hey, it's still an option and you can do it with body weight, so it's highly accessible. But how can we find a movement that is going to be easy to load without a partner, that is going to allow for perfect range of motion, and on top of that, target the serratus in particular? Well, my friends, I have a solution for you. It's called the serratus punch. It's a movement you can do with a band or with a cable. It has both a negative and positive phase, so you get a good stretch and a good contraction, and it's extremely easy to set up, so I'm putting it in the S tier. Personal anecdote, when I broke my ribs, the way I rehabbed my ribs was through this. By strengthening and thickening my serratus muscles, I allowed the rib to take a step back. So not only is it good for aesthetics, it's also extremely good for health. Which leads us nicely to the next category of exercises I'll be grading, which are health and rehab exercises that for some of them do target the abs, like the bird dog. Yeah, you're going to have to get some ab stability to be able to do that movement, but it's never going to give you a six-pack, so Scrawny-tier. Then you have the dead bug, which is aptly named because you look like a dead bug. This one does require the legs to go into the body and to get closer to the chest, so there is some ab development, but it's not that skewed towards hypertrophy. It's again better for people who are trying to rehab their core. So mediocre tier. On top of that, neither of these movements you can load. And the same is also true for mountain climbers. It's impossible to load the movement. You can try with ankle weights, I don't recommend it. This is the perfect exercise if you want to feel the burn. Now, the burn is not a valid variable of hypertrophy, but hey, it feels good. I get it. Some people just want to be able to feel that burn, and if that's what you want, give this a try. It's also hard for cardio and for conditioning, which is why in all of these like P90X like footage that again middle-aged men love so much, and you're going to have some buff and sweaty dude who is going to scream at you through the TV to motivate you to finally get those abs that you've wanted for the past 20 years, and then you do it again the next year because you cannot stick to your commitments. So that's for the mountain climbers. Then we have the reverse crunches. So crunches are bad. How could reverse crunches be any better? Well, it's simply because you do not move your thoracic spine. You don't try to reach for your legs with your head and with your shoulders like an idiot. They stay nice and stable, the lower back stays flat, and what happens is simply that the hip flexors are going to bring the legs away from the body and closer to the body. And yes, it does work the abs, it's extremely noob friendly, so I think that this also is an excellent ab exercise. But we can do even better, because the problem with this is that if you get strong enough, again, it's going to be too hard to go to failure, it's going to be hard to progress. The next type of crunch in this tier list is the exact opposite. Even if you're very strong and you have a very good six-pack, I guarantee you that this one will make you suffer. And its name is the Cannonball Crunches that I'm placing in the S tier as well, because it fulfills the function of the abdominals beautifully. It brings the legs closer to the torso, but it also stabilizes the body throughout the movement because you are in a hollow position. So all things like a V sit-up or a hollow body crunch, all of that to me falls into the cannonball crunch category. They are all very good in my opinion. Problem being, of course, that they are hard to load. So these are best used as a finisher. But fear not, I'm not done shitting on crunches because now we're going to talk about the bicycle crunch. So this is typical of ab exercises. It's something that looks hard, is hard because it's going to kill your cardio, but the results you're going to get from it are extremely poor because some guy decided that it would be a good idea to implement a cycling of the legs in the movement. And I'm certain that most people do this because they've seen the Rocky movies, and in the Rocky movies, of course, the hero does this because it looks cool. You are not Rocky Balboa. Stop doing movement to impress others in the gym, and you will find that your results are going to be much better. So this is D tier. And the heel tap is slightly above. So in the big family of bending exercises for the obliques, this one is once again extremely disappointing. But hey, I guess for someone who has never targeted their obliques in particular ever, this could be a good introduction just to get a feel for it. It's also impossible to overextend the spine in this position because while you run into your own legs, so it's only mediocre, you won't get much result from it, but it's not horrible either. However, something like a windshield wipers to me will always be superior because, surprise, surprise, it fulfills the function of twisting the spine by moving the pelvis to the left and to the right. And this is something that you can do laying down, you can do it hanging, it's extremely versatile. Problem, you can't load it, and on top of that, the range of motion is not that good because, well, your obliques are only really working on the extreme sides of that range of motion. When your legs are in the middle, nothing really happens. So it's safe to say that half of the movement is completely useless, which is why I'm only placing it in the decent tier. Still, great movement for the obliques. You are going to fill your obliques, especially because you're supposed to catch the weight of your legs as you revert back into a new rep, which can be extremely difficult and can lead to injury, so be careful. But I'll always prefer a Russian twist over that movement. For the reason I said earlier, the range of motion is much more relevant and you can load the movement. So I'm putting the Russian twist in the A tier. It's also one of these burn movements that is going to make you want to die. And I know some of you guys actually enjoy it when you train your abs. But it cannot hold a candle to the landmine twist. This is the superior twisting variation when it comes to training your obliques. I don't care what anyone says. Yes, it's used by athletes, but bodybuilders should also be utilizing it because it's the way the body wants to function. When you twist at the core, you also twist at the hips, and you also move your toes throughout the movement. So if you have a landmine in your gym and you want to develop your obliques and grow them to the point that you're going to look like one of these Greek statues with these blocky obliques, absolutely give this one a try. I'm putting it in the Greek god tier for a reason. And also it looks pretty cool, you know. For once, an exercise that makes you look like a badass also trains you like a badass. Which is not true for the next movement that admittedly is amazing and super impressive, but not that great for abs, and that is the human flag, which is one of the hardest calisthenics movements ever. But again, just like the planche, it mostly works through stabilization, so I'm putting it also in the scrawny tier. I think that when it comes to calisthenics, the passive characteristics of the sport are much more relevant to hypertrophy than the active motions, making something like the hollow body position extremely relevant for us bodybuilders because it's free hypertrophy. If you can do your push-ups, your ring push-ups, your pull-ups in that posture, your abs are going to have to be recruited to stabilize the body without you having to do some acrobatic movement on top of it. So it goes into mediocre tier. And the same logic goes for the L-sit. So you can do a passive L-sit, which is already great because it's extremely demanding for the abs, but much, much easier than a planche or a front lever. Someone like me, for example, who is now 215, can do an L-sit. So it's much more accessible and much more hypertrophy friendly. And on top of that, you can do it passively when you do your pull-ups. And I've even heard some calisthenics athletes say that it also heightens the recruitment of the lats. I haven't done enough L-sit pull-ups to know, but what I know for a fact is that if you can get some free hypertrophy points for the abs while also doing the best upper back movement in existence, I don't see why you wouldn't do it. So L-sit position in the decent tier. But when it comes to doing something acrobatic and that looks cool, I think we will all agree that the inverted sit-up is the king. If you've watched anime, I'm certain that you have tried at some point to loop your legs around a tree branch to do your sit-ups in that position. It's super badass. The problem is that it's tough to get in that position, and also it's tough to get out of that position. Because once your core and abs hit failure on that movement, you're now stuck upside down, and that can actually be very dangerous. So I'm putting that into the excellent tier. It's still a sit-up, the stretch is unmatched, but I also think that the strength curve is not that good because that last portion of extension is more spinal decompression than it is actually ab recruitment. No, if you really want to look cool as fuck in the gym, but also do something that is incredible for hypertrophy, you have to go with the dragon flag. Dude, the name itself, dragon flag. Is there a coolest name for an exercise in existence? And then you have the fact that it was popularized by one of the coolest dude in existence, Bruce Lee, and you have something that if I did not put in the Greek god tier, I would be cursed by the god of hypertrophy immediately. So S tier, very difficult movement, very challenging on your stability, but it will absolutely develop your core. To the point that it can actually be risky because since you start with a negative, you can actually strain your abdominal wall. So please be extremely careful and do slow negatives on that movement. But this is typically the type of things that if you progress on and you're serious about, you will see results. There's no way around it. Something that you will see no results with whatsoever is an ab circuit. So you know it's these things where you do 30 crunches, then 30 leg raises, then 30 Russian twists. And it's this mindset that because you felt the burn, it's going to be super effective. Well, actually, it's the exact opposite. Now, you're not going to progressively overload because you're going to have to stick with body weight. You're going to have shit intensity as a result. You're going to sandbag like a motherfucker because you have to survive the exercise selection. And you'll never stick to it. You'll do it for 2 weeks and then you'll never do it again. So, dragon flags done 2 times a week for a year will always beat 10 exercises of an ab circuit done for 2 weeks. Consistency trumps that level of bullshit intensity all day, every day. However, this does not mean that standalone exercises are always good. You can always count on fitness personalities to come up with bullshit that looks effective but does nothing. Example, the pile-off press. I had never heard of this shit before, and if I showed it to 100 people, none of them would tell me that this works the abs, because it doesn't. It's sold to people as something that trains the stabilization of the core, but if you want to train that function, just do heavy squats and deadlifts, dude. Why would you do this? There's no twisting, there's no bending, you just literally stand there. And so, just like anything that involves doing nothing, it also gets you no results. So I'm going to put it in the scrawny tier. Right? Even something as obnoxious as a medicine ball throw is much more effective for hypertrophy simply because you have to twist at the spine to be able to throw that ball. And even though there is no negative, it's still a movement that is going to develop the core and the obliques in particular. It's much better for athletic performance, so I'm only going to put it in C tier. And it's also really, really annoying to hear someone slam a ball times and times again into a wall. If you're going to make noise, at least do heavy deadlifts. But hey, if you want attention, it's a good solution. But there's an even better way to make sure that everyone in the gym is going to look at you like you're a complete weirdo, and that is the bear crawl, which is the action of getting on all four and crawling around. And there's a variation of that called the high bear crawl that is going to greatly involve the serratus muscle because there's a ton of scapular motion. Now this is more of a conditioning / cardio exercise, so it only goes into the decent tier. But for people who have a tough time feeling their serratus on movements like serratus push-ups or punches, this could be a very nice way to warm up for that area in particular. Still, if you're going to do something on the floor that is going to also recruit the legs to some extent, you should always prioritize a rollout, for example, with an ab wheel, because it's going to fulfill that very same function of extending the arms in front of the body, which is going to stretch the serratus, but also require a ton of stabilization, so it's going to hit the entire core. This is a super good exercise, extremely difficult. You have to walk up to it, so you can start on your knees, but eventually you'll be able to do 4 reps. And when it comes to rollout variations, I'm making a distinction between one done with the implement, the ab wheel, and one done with a barbell, because to me, the one done with the implement that is built for that motion is only excellent. The issue with that close grip is that it's going to prevent scapular motion when you extend the arms in front of you, which can lead to shoulder injuries. Some people actually hurt their shoulders severely on this. So what I recommend instead is doing it with a barbell. It's the exact same thing. It allows you to roll out, but now you can set your grip and you can decide the width of the arms. And so I'm putting this one into the Greek god tier. And that is going to conclude this ultimate ab exercises tier list. As you can see, I put as many exercises in as possible, even some exotic ones, because what truly counts when it comes to developing your abs is consistency, is putting in the work. But if you don't like the movements you're doing, you're not going to stick to it. But now, with at least 20 exercises in the S and A tier, you have absolutely no excuse to not train your abs directly. And you also know every single thing that you should be looking for in a good ab exercise to avoid all the ones that are simply going to be a waste of your time. If you are still a bit confused as to how to plan your ab routine, I actually made an ab master plan that is going to detail everything you need to do step by step to get to a six-pack. If you have missed it, you can access it directly in the pinned comments. And this is going to be that for this video. So according to the poll, the next muscle group that you guys want to see is going to be the quads. And based on the current upload schedule, that should be coming out early July. I hope you enjoyed this tier list. Have an excellent rest of your day, and I will see you very soon.